I'm your host, Jack, your failure connoisseur, and today my guest is Isabelle Cuisset. Her background is in fashion. She used to work in merchandising and actually still does a little bit as part-time. She's still part of the fashion world. But despite her background in the fashion industry, she has now got really into the world of Webflow. Her website, Isawabi, is a really interesting concept, which we'll talk a little bit about. She has a sense of soulful minimalism, freely inspired by wabi-sabi Japanese wisdom. What is her interest in Japan? We'll work that out in the course of this interview too. But although she's doing both fashion and also doing freelancing, she is not always successful, as this whole podcast is all about. The failures that we'll talk about in today's episode are what you see is not always what you get. Getting content from her clients and finding discipline, learning something new every single day. So, Isabelle, welcome to the Webflower podcast.
Thank you. Thank you.
I am so glad you're here because we met in London very, very briefly. And I was like, hey, this is the first time we met at the Webflower meetup. And then I kind of was like in a whirlwind of like trying to say hi to people arriving and letting people in and stuff. So I didn't get to properly chat with you, but I'm really, really glad you're here now.
No, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm super excited to have this chat with you, actually. Like, I'm really curious about the questions you're going to ask me. And yeah, let's do it.
We're going to get into some deep, dark stuff today. Mm-hmm. No, we're not. We're just going to... You've got so much experience in the fashion world, and that clearly plays a big part into your aesthetics. So I'm really excited to talk to you. But before we get into that, what is your relationship with failure?
So that's an interesting question, because when you sent me this brief, like, what are your 3 failures? My first reaction was, I don't have any failure. I don't use this word. And it is true. I don't use it. But then, okay, so I've got to think about that. Like, why don't I use failure? What does it mean for me? Like, what is that? So I think describing something as a failure is putting a stop to it, is putting a definitive judgment to something you're doing or you have done. And I think it's this idea that I'm not really agreeing with, because I see every experience as a path, as something that continues. And the way you look at things, it's never black or white. It's, yes, maybe you didn't get that job. Maybe you even lost a job at a certain point. But so it's a failure. Maybe you can call it that in a certain way, but then it opens to new opportunities and it enables you to go further on your path. So I guess, yeah, the only thing I would call a failure, maybe, because I was thinking about it, is there something I would call a failure? Yeah, when I tried to change a light bulb the first time I moved in this flat, like it just bursted into my head. Okay, that was a failure. I think that's it. But in terms of work, as long as I commit to something and I'm fully like aware of the decisions that I'm making, as long as I try my best, I don't consider it as a failure. Maybe a failure would be not to be motivated by something and doing something anyway, like being kind of off and not really caring. I think also maybe I trick myself into never feeling like I'm making a failure, and that's a very possible thing. That's what I was thinking also. Because for instance, in my clients' projects, the way I do it, because I work mostly with, I'm at the beginning of my journey, it's been only like 3 years, and I work mostly with smaller clients, independent artists. And so those projects are relatively, let's say, small in size, but they're super interesting because they always have a strong creative point of view. But in my process, I don't ask upfront payment, and I'm maybe the exception in the world of freelancer, because my terms and conditions is that we work together until my client and myself are both satisfied, and I don't stop until that happens, and then I deliver the project. And in my experience, this has never failed as a principle, as a process, because actually there is no pressure on the client. There is no pressure on myself to actually, maybe because if I expected some money at the start, yes, maybe that would be a failure if after a certain time frame the project wouldn't be delivered. Or so all I'm saying is that I'm building my world to avoid the concept of failure. But I will add also, because I was reading your 2024 like killer plan, like the freelancer killer plan. After the meetup, like which was so great, I was obviously like looking at your website and seeing like what you were doing. And so that is brilliant. Like I really enjoyed like going through the killer plan, even if it was a bit late in the season, but doesn't matter. And you've put one of the videos you've put online in that chapter is how to break addiction to negative thoughts. And I think that relates to that. And I completely agree with the content of that video. Like when you think about failure, already you don't feel good. And I make all efforts possible, I guess, to just like feel good about what I'm doing and the way I'm progressing, whatever happens. Maybe it's a very naive way to see things, but yeah. Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer.
Hey, that makes sense.
About it because yeah, that was a tricky question for me.
Hey, it's a tricky question with a complicated answer, and that's totally fair enough. I think the response that you had about having a positive mindset and kind of riding through failure, or at least riding through difficulties, because like you say, this idea of failure is kind of like a hard stop idea almost, isn't it? It's like, I failed. When actually there's so much more nuance to that idea, you know? There's so many mistakes and bumps in the road, or however you want to describe it, that you need to have a positive mindset in order to overcome them or learn from them or whatever the case is. But it's not like you're a failure, full stop. Yeah, exactly. It's something that you kind of move through. Tell me a little bit about this idea. I'm so intrigued by this. You said that you never charge your clients before you start work. There's no down payment. There's no deposit. What is that idea about? That's such an interesting concept in my head.
So I organize myself in a way that I obviously like stagger projects. So that in terms of cash flow, it needs to work as well, obviously. But it's a way to relieve pressure and to keep for me, the enthusiasm on both sides like quite high from the start, because there is not this financial pressure, let's say. As long as I can make it work in terms of cash flow and that I stagger projects sufficiently so that I get the revenues of some while I start some other ones, for me, the principle works. And basically, I'm in total control of each projects because I do them obviously on my Webflow professional dashboard. At the end of the project, once they've paid, I create an account for them with an alias email and I transfer it to them. But let's say I don't give anything of my work until the payment anyway. So I don't feel at risk, obviously. Yeah, I think it's about working a flow of project that is reaching the same level of cash flow that you would expect from down payment, of prepayment and final payment, but organizing things a different way so that it's still working. I guess also because I'm quite new. In the beginning, it was the perfect way to start because I was doing my first projects and that was definitely like relieving some pressure from myself. But then I figured out that actually that was working well for me. Again, it's also because the size of each project is relatively small. So I generally spend between 4 weeks and 6 weeks from kickoff meeting to final training. So it's not such a long time and I can stagger several of them at the same time.
Okay, fascinating. I've never heard of anyone start the work before at least receiving some kind of payment. But I guess in terms of like the pressure of you delivering work, if you're doing this only part-time as well, and then the people that you're working with at the start are maybe like people that you're friends with, or maybe like connections that you're quite intimate and you trust already. So that must like slightly change the relationship because you're like, well, I trust this person. They're in my network. They might be a friend of a friend. Or
at the beginning, that's what it was. But nowadays, I don't work for people I know. And So I don't have this trust. Obviously, I feel a client or not, like from the initial talks, etc. But if the motivation on their side is really to have a website, also I make sure that's the point I was highlighting, like in my answers. I make sure I get the content before starting. So already they committed to put together some materials, some content. So they worked on their side. They've put some effort to kick off everything. I mean, touch wood, but so far I never had any issue with somebody withdrawing. Only one, she had a baby. She needs to come back. But she hadn't delivered the content up front, and that's why I'm saying that, because I think that's the key point. When there is still some work to do on their side, once you start the project, that's where, based on experience, it's sometimes a bit trickier. On the few cases I
can unravel a little bit. Yeah, that makes sense. So tell me a little bit about your fashion background and then how you found Webflow, because you're, a high flyer. You are director of merchandising for various different companies. When I've looked at your LinkedIn, you've worked for Burberry, Loewe, Stella McCartney. And then you are now part-time in the fashion world and then doing Webflow on the side. Talk to me about that. How did that come about?
Yeah, actually, Webflow came indirectly through fashion. So it was during COVID. That might sound like a cliche, but I decided to relocate in the UK after having spent some time in Spain and commuting like a crazy woman between Paris, Madrid, and London every week. Well, that had to stop because I was living my life in airports and no. So I came back to London and we were working with a friend on a small fashion project. We had an idea that we wanted to put together. And we needed a website. And for that occasion, I first came in contact, like chatting with some web designers and developers. And I'm not sure exactly how that happened, but it's really like, it felt like a passion falling from the sky. Like the more I was talking about it, the more I was interested, like hooked. I ended up telling my friend, you know what, I'm going to do a website. And so I started with tutorials. I started with WordPress, and then I felt it was like maybe 2-3 months along the way. I felt quite frustrated with just staying on the surface of things, and I decided to enroll in a Web Development Bootcamp. It was an online school. It still exists. It was renamed since then. I enrolled into that bootcamp. That was like amazing, with like some sprints every 2 weeks. We went into also like doing some basic React apps, etc. And along the way, because I really felt we were doing a bit of front end, mostly front end, but a bit of back end as well. And that enabled me to find a bit my space, like what I enjoyed the most. And it was definitely like the visual, creative front end side of things. And I came across Webflow at that time. So it was like, a bit more than 3 years ago. I started playing with it as I was doing my bootcamp, and I fell in love with the Webflow platform, because after WordPress and all the clunky like dashboard, and that didn't feel like the future. Sorry, no offense, but that's how I felt. Webflow seemed like super clean. It was at the time the university lessons, so like brilliant. There still are, but it was. Really like excellent. And so I went into that, and I was still doing my bootcamp, and I decided to set up my own business, and I started indeed to do websites for friends of friends or relations, and that's how it all started.
Wow, what a journey. But then you were like, I'm going to do this part-time alongside fashion.
No, actually, that was not the plan. The plan was to do that full-time. What happened is that at the time I set up my own business as a freelancer, I was approached by a brand in London that I like, that I appreciate, like the story and the identity of this small brand. It's quite small. I knew also some people working there, especially like the creative director. And I told them, no, I'm sorry, I'm not free. I'm doing my bootcamp, I'm gonna make websites now. And they, yeah, but maybe we can make it work. And what about, so first they were like, oh, can you come like 4 days a week? No, I need more time. I just need to to do my thing. And at the end, they convinced me to make a trial for 3 days a week. We tried it. I was still in my bootcamp, still doing my websites. And actually, I think it was a surprise on both sides. But I really nowadays appreciate the balance between the two activities as well, because on one side it's more like managing teams and working with physical products, and then I've got this Webflow activity where I'm in my flow and I'm doing my craft and I'm with my clients like from beginning to end. So I would say I'm doing it because it's them, and I don't want to let them down. And I'm happy that we found a balance. They trusted me and I trusted them. If that adventure would stop, yes, I would go full time in Webflow, that's for sure. But it was kind of a coincidence or life circumstance, let's say, that both really happened at the same time.
And I guess also, like when you've just finished a boot camp, you might not be getting clients, you might not have that regular stream of income. Whereas like if you've got the 3 days a week, it's like, okay, well, at least that is definitely coming in every month.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's, so I'm quite grateful that it happened this way, because it made my transition easy. It gave me the luxury to actually choose my clients, which is quite rare when you start. So yeah, I probably would have grown faster across those 3 years if I was doing it full time. But I think it's a good compromise because of this identity, because of this brand's identity and team. I enjoy it, but I think it's a really unique case and combination.
It is a really unique scenario. I've never interviewed anyone on the podcast that's like working in fashion and then has like a completely separate kind of freelancer identity as well. But I think it's really important to say that if anyone's listening who's like just about to finish university or school or whatever stage in life they're at, and then they're like, right, I'm going to go 100% in on freelancing. If you don't have that depth of skill set to actually be a successful freelancer, I just feel like freelancing is really, really hard off the bat. And it's great to have some kind of steady income stream, whether that's joining an agency and then freelancing, learning how to freelance by being in that agency, or potentially like you, Isabelle, having that steady few days a week of income coming in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because if you don't have a past experience where you could build a network of clients, or for instance, in my case, I work with artists, but if you work as a freelancer more with marketing agencies, maybe you had the opportunity to get in touch with some of them being employed somewhere, and then it's probably much easier to go freelancing. Yes, in my case, I have to build everything from scratch. So yes, definitely, it's more comfortable to transition that way.
Yeah. Kind of baby steps into the world of Webflow freelancing, I think is healthy. Are you ready to dive into the most difficult questions we'll talk about today?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, let's dive in. Tell me about failure number 1. What you see is not always what you get.
That was not something I learned in the bootcamp. That was definitely something that I learned through Webflow. So I basically naively thought that when you were putting a little bit of code or CSS setup through Webflow or through bespoke coding, whatever, you could expect more or less the same result across all operating system, all devices, all browsers, as I guess every beginner. But I realized fast enough that especially when you use the latest updates in CSS, so some brands, some operating system are definitely lagging behind. So obviously with time you have things that settle and align across everything, but yeah, unless you test everything like so roughly, with Brother Stack obviously is quite a good tool, you can expect some surprises, and that's not a surprise you want your client to have. So that's a very beginner's advice, because all Webflowers know that.
Okay, let's underline that point because, so browserstack.com, before sending, the final client website over to your client on the staging link, test it thoroughly. I'm not just saying on the little Webflow designer and it looks great and you're like, cool, that's done, send that over. No, test it on different browsers and use browserstack.com. Although this is maybe, well, you might say beginner advice. I've worked for agencies and they don't do this.
They don't do this?
So,
oh, really?
I mean, I honestly, it's not like I'm shocked by how like cowboy a lot of the time the like offboarding processes, to be honest, with some Webflowers or agencies. So I think it is important to say with browserstack.com, you can actually check what it's like on different screen sizes properly, but also on different browsers. So it's just really good to check that before sending the final link over to the client. It will save you a ton of headache. And if you don't check it and you just send it over to your client and they do the QA for you, it's going to look terrible and you're going to lose a lot of trust. And any chance of a retainer, maybe you've just lost that chance because it's like this final 5%, 2%, maybe this offboarding, I think is just massively underrated and under talked about.
Yeah, because not every person has the latest Samsung. They might have an old iPhone. Sorry, I'm dropping brand name.
Hey, no, it's fine. I mean, it's important to talk about that. I think a lot of the time, if you just check it on your personal phone, you're like, yeah, it looks great, cool. Yeah. Send that over. It's like, no, it's not done. And yeah, I think what I've found is that when I was working for this agency a few agencies ago, that essentially you're just exhausted at the end. You're just like, the Q&A is so boring. You're just like, just get this out the door. Like, I'm sure it's fine. Let's just send it to the client. And I think, when there's tight deadlines and there might not be like a Q&A tester in the agency, it might just be you as a freelancer who's just spent however many days and weeks building this thing, and Q&A is just not fun. It's just not fun.
No, it's not fun.
It's important, but it's got to be done. And oftentimes you just send it and then the client's like, this looks shit. What are you talking about? And you're like, oh God, got to go back and make those changes in a sweat and a fluster. So do your due diligence, do your offboarding properly, make sure that you've tested it. And what's really great is if you show the client what your Q&A process looks like. So, if you've gone through a checklist, you're like, I've checked it on the different screen sizes. I've checked it on these browsers. I've gone through to make the H1s, H2s, H3s are all there. If you can send that checklist through to the client when you do the offboarding, that really, really helps to just be like, look, I've done my due diligence. Here's what I've done. Here's what is correct. And it just shows that you've actually thought about the offboarding a little bit more than just, here's the link. Do you want me to transfer it over to your Webflow account?
Yeah, no, completely. Especially because clients in general don't imagine that could even be the case, that it might have looked perfect on your own device, but on theirs, it's not. They don't even understand how that is possible. So, I think that's important. In my bootcamp, for instance, we would talk about like QA testing with Lighthouse or other tools, but not that. No.
Yeah. There's a lot of people in the Webflow space that might have watched, the Webflow University videos, and they might not actually have such a good idea about the tools around Webflow that will really, really help, ensure that they make sure that they have a really good client experience. Are there any other tools apart from Browser Stack that you are like, guys, you need to know this. This is a really helpful tool.
I mean, again, it's based on my 3 years experience, but obviously Tiny PNG for the image compression or likes, Handbrake for video, and also those alternative hosting solutions for videos when they're too big to put on Webflow or you don't want them to be from Vimeo or from YouTube. I use a lot Cloudinary as a platform for assets that are a bit bigger than the limits, even after Handbrake compression, or even like the Amazon S3 buckets combined with a CloudFront distribution. I've got one client, he's got like really like big videos, and even after compression, it's over Cloudinary limit over Webflow. So that goes into Amazon bucket. So yes, it's just to have a set of tools and solutions for the different cases upfront, which are, it's details. It's not like the core of the design, but that makes your life easier because it comes every time as a question otherwise.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of the time, and I've definitely been guilty of this, you're so excited to show the client the website that you haven't checked the Google Lighthouse scores. So the performance of the website is terrible. It takes ages to load. Obviously, there'll be a high bounce rate and like, you know, all that stuff that you might think, oh, Jack, like, I don't really care about that stuff. I just want to make it animated and I want it to be fun and playful and do the kind of visual creative stuff. But actually, this needs to be a functioning site. And I wish I cared more about that earlier. So use tools that will help you, like Browser Stack, Handbrake, Cloudinary. These are all really useful tools to make sure that images are not massive files, videos are not massive files. The website actually has good performance, and means that, you know, on top of learning Webflow, you have tools that will really, really help you be a successful freelancer. Is there anything else that we need to add before we move on to your next failure, Isabelle?
Not yet. He might come back. You mean as extra
there's
tool?
So many different tools.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I've got my setup because I like to experiment integrating, obviously, other JavaScript libraries into Webflow. But that's not for everyone. It's only if you like to do those things. But with Visual Studio and the boilerplate with Vite.js, I think it's Armansal. It's quite a well-known boilerplate if you Google it, like Vite.js Webflow boilerplate. It's got a very like simple one and you can plug a bit of code in your Webflow body, like bespoke code, and that enables you to do all your trials live without publishing the site every time. There are other options to do the same thing. I like this one because I like to do it in VS Code. And yeah, I mentioned that, but ChatGPT is definitely one of my best friends too. I mean, it's like having a private teacher when you want to try something different and you need a bit of guidance or somebody to bounce your suggestions to. And so, yeah, so this boilerplate, for instance, in VS Code, I use it all the time. Yeah. And I use GSAP a lot. Yeah. Because sometimes the Webflow animations, or for instance, if you want to do an animation with a vector, scaling a vector, for instance, in a website, if you do it with Webflow native animations, you will see it gets a bit blurry. Like it's not like, in terms of performance, it doesn't even work like so well visually because it's too heavy for that sort of animation. If you use something like GSAP, it's already optimized and you can scale the size 30 times. It's still going to look sharp, like alongside the process, the animation. So it thinks like that. But again, it's not that everyone has to necessarily enjoy that and use those kind of tools. It's because I like this explorative part as well. Yeah.
Awesome. These are all really, really helpful tidbits for any Webflowers that are at the start of their journey who are exploring all the tools around Webflow. Webflow, I kind of think as like a plate that you can, you know, there's all sorts of stuff to build on top of. And there's so many different parts to creating a website as you quickly find out when you start freelancing. And you're just like, can Webflow do this? Then there's the Webflow app marketplace with all these different tools. And then there's all these tools that have been around for years that will integrate with Webflow if you have a little bit of know-how. Every time I speak to other Webflowers, I'm like, oh, use that tool. Or there's a little piece of advice there or a little nugget. So definitely recommend speaking to other Webflowers regularly, finding out what tools, tips, tricks they have and use, because not everything is in Webflow's incredible YouTube channel. There is a lot there, obviously, but there's a lot of stuff that's not there. So make sure that you talk to real people who are in the arena. Isabelle, tell me about failure number 2, getting content from your clients before starting a project.
Yeah, so that I mentioned a little bit already as part of the no upfront payment process. I think I've realized across a few cases that if I wasn't making sure that my client was putting the work upfront and delivering me with some content, of course, it can change, update the content later on. It can be even like placeholder text. They're not completely final. But it's very difficult and sometimes frustrating, actually, to chase a client for content in the middle of the project. Once you started the design, you maybe like build some concepts already, maybe even some animation prototypes for certain things, and you're still missing like a key part to just build your CMS and have everything like populated and build everything together. So yeah, for me, in terms of project management flow, now I'm super strict. It's like until they give me the full structure, and I help them. I make suggestions as well if they need a little bit of hints or what could be the copy on which page, etc. Yeah, for me, it's important to start only when I've got the draft of the full content.
And when you're talking about the content,
it's text.
Okay,
assets,
So
videos, artworks. Yeah,
the whole set of content, and so in terms of copy, because one big thing that I've spoken to a lot of Webflowers about is like copy is the big thing that everyone needs, no one wants to pay for. And when you say, well, we're not copywriters, but we can do a draft of the copy and then you can react to that, it's a lot easier to react to copy than just to be like stare at a blank page and think, oh, okay, the home page, I'm just gonna write this and hope it's okay. Like, do you provide like a draft of the copy, or do you just say, okay, write me what you think you're gonna need, and then I'll do the design from that? Or how do you approach that?
So because I work mostly with artists, the copy part is generally quite simple, but not always, because I don't necessarily only work with visual artists. And so I basically like organize their shared folder into like the different sections, the different parts, and I ask them to just segment the work into different parts. Generally, they're able to do it. I have one example, for instance, when she's a bit struggling because she's not too sure like about what to write where. So in that case, I take a bit the Relume principle, but just straight into ChatGPT based on my sitemap. I populate something, I correct it a bit myself, and I share the document with the client for them to have a bit of starting point, inspiration, and start from that. So it's really case by case, but yeah, if I need to go one step further and just give some prompts, it's true that I don't hesitate to use ChatGPT if needed. I've got some copywriters' contacts, but as you say, most of the time they don't necessarily want to pay for it.
I think copywriting for a lot of clients is like, well, I know how to write. I can do copy. Like, why would I need someone else to do that? But actually, oh my God, when you work with a copywriter, you're like, oh, this is so helpful. It's like a game-changing thing.
Yeah.
But it's quite frustrating when clients are like, we don't want to do the copy. Yeah. We want you to do the copy, even though you're not copywriters. And it's like this kind of strange game of like, okay, I can't do the website unless I have the copy, but you can't do the copy unless I try and like show you something that you could use. And it's like this strange game. Yeah. But we've definitely found at the studio that I work at, Maku Studio, that if we do a rough version of what we think the copy should be, then they can respond and actually edit that copy so that we've got a final version. And that really speeds up the process. So it sounds interesting that you've got a very similar situation.
How do you make this initial version? Do you use some tools, or do you use somebody in your team who is more of a copywriter? How do you make it happen?
Well, what we find is that when people say, I want a new website, what they're really saying, they say, I want a new website, but we already have the brand identity and we don't want to rebrand. So they want to refresh, right? I hate that word, refresh. we want a brand refresh. Okay, so you've given me your brand guidelines, in air quotes, if you can't see this on YouTube. And it's like the brand guidelines are like a logo and a color palette. And you're like, okay, then this is going to be quite hard to work with and then they're like, well, we're open to, the brand guidelines aren't that strict. We can, if you have some kind of creative license to actually, and it's like, okay, we're basically kind of doing a rebrand here. But one thing that we've been doing with clients is brand strategy. So we ask them, what is their mission, vision, values? Who is their target audience? Like, we'll ask them a lot of questions and then we'll do some research. And that piece of work is generally the basis of the copy for the website, because we've kind of done the work up front of like working out what their business is and why they should be, how are they differentiated, and kind of ask them a load of questions that they almost give you the copy by virtue of just speaking. Yeah. And you have a lot of alignment by that point, because you've got, this is what we've agreed, that this is, how you want to sound. This is your tone of voice. And that can be kind of translated to the website quite easily. And yeah, so who does that? Like someone in the team will actually do that piece of work. But we've only done that a couple of times. I think with bigger websites, that might be harder, because, if someone's like, oh, we just want a brand refresh, and then we do the brand strategy, that brand strategy text can't necessarily be used. Like, that's going to be a hell of a lot of work that's included in the project if we're doing that process. So like you say, I think it is a little bit case by case. And sometimes the client they don't seem to be that bothered about the copy, weirdly. Like, they're not as ferocious about the copy compared to the actual visual design.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
we try and explain SEO is important, and we do actually need to think about the headlines a little bit more than just, put what you think is best. It's like, well, okay, this, so it's a bit of an education piece as well. Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, great. I feel like we're just kind of sharing how we both do web flowing rather than the failures now. But this is something that I have certainly failed on as well. This chicken and egg, and how to give great service while not necessarily just bending over backwards doing things that you don't really know how to do. And I think that's, there's a fine line between being helpful for a client and being like, yeah, I'll deal with the copy, but actually just not really knowing how to do it well. And if you're not a copywriter, which you're not as a Webflower, like, you might not actually be helping the client by saying, I'll do it for you. Yeah, don't worry, I can do it. It's like, maybe you do need to push back and say, look, this is not part of, the contract. This is not what we've agreed. Whatever you do, if anyone's listening to this, like, wait, Jack, Isabelle, do I do the copy? Do I not do the copy? I think it's important in your contract to be clear what you are doing and what you are not doing. So regardless of whether you want to try and do the copy like with ChatGPT or try and do it yourself, I just think it's important so that before you start the project, and the client knows what is happening with, the content of the website. Like, what is their job? What is your job? And just be really, really clear on that before starting the work. That's my 2 cents on that. What do you feel about that, Isabelle?
Totally agree. And that makes me think, actually, yes, there is another tool that I use and that is very useful in that context. It's Bonsai, Hello Bonsai app, because that's where I do all my clients' proposals. And I outline exactly like the brief of the project and what the client should provide at the beginning of the project and all the cost, and everything is there. Basically, it's like it's a quote and a proposal at the same time. And it translates into an invoice when the time comes for the client to pay. Yeah, that's a platform I find very useful.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think this comes back to a bigger point, which is essentially the more organized you are, the better service you're going to provide to the client, the more relaxed you're going to be doing the project, because there's a clear timeline, there's a clear set of, here's in black and white what I'm doing, here's what you're doing, client. And it just means that everyone has a clearer step-by-step plan for what is going to happen. But yeah, Hello Bonsai, shout out. We also use that at Maku Studio and love it. It's seriously important tool to make sure that we have all our ducks in a row. Okay, we have labored failure number 2. Let us move on to failure number 3. Tell me about failure number 3, finding it beneficial to be disciplined, learning something new every day.
Yes, I think it's quite important. For me, I like to plan my time, not efficiently. I don't like the word efficiently because it's also pleasurable. But I like to plan my time in a way that works for me and that enables to give me time to learn new things. Because in this world, there are new tools, new ways of doing things that pop up like every day. And to keep a pace with everything that's happening, I mean, obviously, there are the various Discord communities or X or Facebook, wherever you like to go. But for me, it's important to dedicate some proper time to just experiment, learn new things, work on something else, as opposed to only work on clients' projects, because I think that's where also the growth can happen and the progression in my path can just like go further. And it's not necessarily very easy to do, because it's always a bit tempting sometimes to maybe accept also a bit too much at the same time, because suddenly you have several projects and you have another one that comes back with some updates, another client that comes back with some updates on his website, and you just want to do it. and so this time has to be protected, like the learning time. For me, it's very important, because otherwise I feel like I'm not making progress, or I feel a bit not as motivated to go forward. So yes,
I feel exactly the same. In fact, I have just tried to carve out a day of my week to just explore.
Yeah.
I think like having like playtime. Yeah, kids have playtime. Right?
Yeah. No,
they go and swing on the monkey bars.
Yeah. No,
they go and run around outside. They play it and all of that stuff. We need our playtime. I really firmly believe that. And the more you do client work, the more you find excuses, or maybe you just get sucked into actually not doing your own exploration as much. And you just feel like, I don't know. Well, I don't know about you, Isabelle, but I just feel like you're not really creatively fulfilled as much as you were.
No, there is a sense of something is missing. Like you're not completely fulfilled if you don't do it for a certain period. It's weird because it's still like you're still like working, but it's a totally different type of work. And I think you put it nicely. Yes, it's like playtime. It's like, you're trying some different things, seeing what someone else is doing, just inspecting the way things are done and trying to do the same.
100%. And like maybe looking at one of your favorite websites and then screen grabbing it and then rebuilding it and being like, okay, what have they done? Like, why is this good? That was one of the best bits of advice I got from a previous agency owner that I worked with. He was like, work out why things are good by rebuilding them. Like, look at the pixel spacing in between elements. Like, look at why on mobile, maybe it's not as good an experience. Maybe try and redesign that exact website and be like, okay, how could I improve this? And just kind of get in the weeds of, making and building without the pressures of a client being like, I want this to have a flying unicorn going through the home screen or whatever, and just like, all of that stuff is good and it pays the bills, but make sure that you carve out time for you. That's so important. How do you protect that time though, Isabelle? Because I bet people listening are like, well, yeah, of course I need to have some of my own time, but I've got kids and I've got clients messaging on Slack all the time, different time zones. Like I wake up and I've got emails from people. Like, how do you carve that time out?
For me, what works is that in the morning, generally I work on clients' projects, but the technical part, except maybe on weekends, I will dedicate one morning, if I can allow myself to do that, to the exploration as well. But usually I do the client technical work and design work like in the morning. I tend to do meetings in the beginning, mid-afternoon. And then I take a break. And then the rest of the day before my yoga class is exploration. So that's the kind of typical pattern. But in weekends, sometimes I try to carve even more time for exploration and start it in the morning because that's the best for me, at least. But at least there is always a bit the end of the day. That's why, again, I like the playtime word for that, because it's after the discussions, meetings, a bit more lighter activity. Then you have a bit of that. And then I end up just going out with some friends or doing some yoga or just like, so it's that's the way it works for me.
Awesome. Yeah. I think there's this phrase that I love, which kind of reminds me what you just said. It's actions express priorities. Like if you really value your playtime, then that should be the thing that, you know, you prioritize at the time of day that works best for you. For me, that's early in the morning. That's my playtime. I want to like get up, do stuff first thing that's for me. And that might be like Webflower related stuff, which is quite playful. I quite enjoy that type of thing. Or like looking at a new tool or watching YouTube videos on learning or whatever. But if that's the thing that you want to be a part of your life, then it's up to you to take action to prioritize that basically. But that sounds like a really healthy approach, Isabelle. Important to do.
What are you playing with at the moment? I'm curious.
What am I playing with? I am actually playing with different tools in the app marketplace, in the Webflow app marketplace. So we've been playing with the Figma to Webflow app, which has just got a lot better. Because I think when it initially came out, it was quite janky and it was like, this is actually not that fun to use. But I think it's actually got a lot better and easier. And then I've also been playing around with OptiBase, this A/B testing tool, because one thing that we're trying to do at Maku Studio is a lot more focus on retainers with clients that we actually enjoy working with. So you know how a lot of people are like, hey, we're a retainer. We basically, you know, sign on, pay a certain amount each month, and we'll do whatever you want, tickets, da-da-da-da-da. But what we want to do is actually choose who we offer retainers to, depending on how the initial project has gone. And only if we both enjoy working together and that we can like legitimately offer them something that means that they will want to be on a retainer with us, then we'll offer that. So the A/B testing tool is kind of interesting because I think a lot of the time in the Webflow space, there's a lot of emphasis on launching the website, you know, designing, developing, launch. Okay, cool. Crack on. Good luck, client.
Yeah.
Whereas I think what we want to focus a little bit more on is how we can work over a long period with people that want to scale and grow. So kind of inspired by Keith from Flow Sparrow, who has a kind of, I'd call it like a slow burn retainer agency. He's like, we don't want a lot of clients. We're not trying to sign every single person. We just want consistent partnerships with, you know, a smaller number of clients, which I think is more sustainable and maybe suits us a little bit better. So yeah, that's us. Cool. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, no, that sounds great.
We should definitely talk more about tools and nerdy stuff because I feel like we're both in, like, I like playing and you like playing, so we should play more outside of the podcast. But yes, very excited about the Webflow app marketplace and all the amazing tools that are out there already. There's so much stuff to learn. It's just like, it's exciting, but it's also really overwhelming, which is why playtime is key as well. It's not just play frivolous time. It's also just like, hey, this is actually really useful to like level up how you actually do your job as well. So a bit of a balance there. Isabelle, are you ready for your final question? The hardest question so far.
Well, I thought I had that one already. No.
You thought you'd pass? No. No way. This is it.
Okay.
This is it.
Focus. I'm ready.
Okay, you ready?
Yep.
Okay, what is your next failure going to be?
Considering everything I told you, that's a difficult one.
Well, do you have any more light bulbs to put in your flat is the question.
Yeah, that could be a short answer. Absolutely. I have. I'm waiting to gather a few to call the guy to do it.
Oh, okay. So you found someone who's more qualified to change light bulbs to avoid that failure.
Yeah.
Genius.
I subcontract that part, yes. Okay, what's my next failure? That's okay. I've got to turn the question slightly differently so that the word failure doesn't come in the way and doesn't. Yes. Failing at my karate master. No, my next objective would be. I'm just gonna answer that. Because, and then I'll see how I can turn it around. My next objective would be to work with bigger clients, yet still in the work of art. So, for instance, like gallery spaces or like organizations that curate art, something like slightly bigger projects, but still with that same like creative vibe. So I guess my next failure, which won't happen, would be not to succeed doing that. But then it's a non-failure. It's not answering your question.
But I mean, what you're kind of saying though is that, hey, there's going to be bumps in the road ahead because you're trying to do something that's outside of your comfort zone.
Yeah.
Like you haven't necessarily worked with big galleries before, but that's the goal, and you're sure that there's going to be problems that you need to overcome in that area. So
that's a challenge.
Maybe they're not going to be
difficult.
failures.
But what I believe is like you can get to where you want to, but as long as you put the work, and if you fail once, you try again. So it's like, maybe the first gallery I approach, that won't work, but then I'll approach the second one and I'll get there. I think that's
Amen. You're going to get back on the gallery horse. It's a very weird way to end the episode, saying you'll get back on the gallery horse, but yes, you are going to go again, and you're going to go again stronger and better with more knowledge about how to succeed better. So I think that's beautiful. Isabelle, thank you so much for coming on the Webflower podcast. You have been an incredible guest, and thank you for sharing so vulnerably.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me, and that was a pleasure and really fun as well. Thank you.